seconds from current slide. Okay, you should see a single slide. It might take a while to come up.
Right now it's entire screen, including the text you cannot read.
Yeah, it should switch in a minute.
Okay.
Can you let me know when it's switched?
Now we only see the slide.
Now you only see the slide. Okay, I can begin.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a delay sometimes. Okay, thanks everyone. I'll begin. Right. Welcome everyone. I'd like to preface this presentation with the disclaimer that I'm not an expert in game theory, voting systems, or social choice theory. My background is in academic philosophy, and I approach these subjects as an amateur. The purpose of this presentation is to draw attention to an interesting resource for understanding blockchain governance in Cardano and Catalyst, and to highlight possible further routes of inquiry. The materials presented here will form part of the QADAO Aggelos Philosophy Gitbook, which was successfully voted for in Fund 7 last week. Okay, this presentation is an overview of Professor Aggelos, Kiayias and Philip Lazos' recent paper, Blockchain Governance, published on the 19th of January, 2022. A link to the paper is provided on the slide. Tigo, if you could provide a link in comments, that'd be helpful. Professor Aggelos Kiayias is Chief Scientist at IOG Academic Research and the Chair in Cybersecurity and Privacy at the University of Edinburgh. And Philip Lazos is a Research Fellow at IOG Academic Research. Further details can be found by following their links to their IOG profiles. Okay, the blockchain governance principles, the context, the social choice context. The paper Blockchain Governance was published on the 19th of January, as I said, and it provides a useful entry point into blockchain governance. The author's focus is on voting systems, but the paper also hints at the broader context and references social choice theory, which addresses the more general governance challenge of aggregating individual preferences into societal preferences. Challenges of decentralized. As the authors point out in their introduction, the decentralized nature of blockchain governance introduces new challenges where the diverse needs and preferences of participants will not always align. Therefore, a degree of stability is sought to balance these diverse needs and to mitigate division. In this context, different governing mechanisms may take the form of one, off-chain governance, which is centralized in the trust invested in core developers or key contributors, and two, the voting mechanisms of on-chain governance, which may be more transparent and inclusive. But these mechanisms are no guarantee against community division. If consensus fails, then one part of the community can adopt a change they see as beneficial to themselves, leaving another part of the community behind. Okay, moving on to the first two, the approach the paper takes is to, quote, derive a set of properties that are drawn from general governance principles and election theory, and then interpret them to the blockchain governance setting. The sources that the authors draw on include Council of Europe technical standards for e-voting, the Federal Election Commission's voting system standards, as well as blockchain-specific standards. The authors go on to evaluate a range of blockchain platforms against these properties, identifying their strengths and their weaknesses. But for the sake of brevity, I focus not on covering the entirety of this section, but rather on the author's assessment of Project Catalyst. Just a quick note of related work, which may be of interest to people, is that the authors also refer to a paper called Defining Blockchain Governance, Framework for Analysis and Comparison. And the reason why this might be of interest because it takes an open source approach and defines blockchain governance as the means of achieving the direction, control, and coordination of stakeholders within the context of a given blockchain project to which they jointly contribute. So if you're interested in governance from an open source perspective, I'd recommend looking at that paper. Okay, the first property is a security property. The first, but it has to do with the confidentiality of stakeholder involvement, how participation in governance is secured and verified. The authors define the confidentiality property as secrecy. A blockchain governance system satisfies secrecy if, whenever a decision-making process is held, an adversary cannot guess the inputs of any participant better than an adversarial algorithm, whose only inputs are the overall tally. And if the adversary is a participant, the adversary's input. Now in Catalyst, the authors assess this as mostly secret. Pseudonymity. A blockchain governance system satisfies pseudonymity if no participant is required to reveal their real-life identity to participate in the decision-making process. And the authors assess in Catalyst is assured by voter participation with a wallet address. And then finally, coercion resistance. A blockchain governance system is coercion resistant if, whenever a decision-making process is held, a participant can deceive the adversary into thinking that they have behaved as instructed when the participant has in fact made an input according to their intentions. And in Catalyst, the authors assess the system of somewhat coercion resistant. The ballot itself cannot be decrypted by the voter, so there is nothing to coerce. Okay, and the second security property is verifiability. Verifiability, complements the prior property of confidentiality by going in the opposite direction and making sure that any voting inputs can be independently verified from voter to tally. This property rests on end-to-end verifiability. A blockchain governance system is verifiable if, whenever a decision-making process takes place, participants are able to verify their inputs were properly tallied, and independent observers are able to verify that inputs from eligible participants were properly tallied. Now, the authors assess that in Catalyst, the result or tally of the vote can be independently verified, and a voter can verify that they have voted a particular way, as long as they retain the means to decrypt their vote. Now, to step back from this a little bit, outside of voting, verifiability can also be seen to be relevant to proof of life that we have in our onboarding process of a funded proposer, or the debate about whether identities of community advisors should be known. A balance then in this context always needs to be drawn between incentives for contribution, being funded as a proposer or awarded for CA work, and the security that secrecy and pseudonymity may provide to a contributor. Okay, Pareto efficiency. There is a lot packed into the Pareto efficiency section of the author's blockchain properties paper, and reference is made to the background subject of social choice theory, which encompasses the study of all collective decision processes and procedures. Now, concerns with how individual choices can be aggregated into collective outputs date at least as far back as the Enlightenment with Nicolas de Condorcet, when Nicolas de Condorcet examined the effectiveness of majority voting and how irrational majority preferences may emerge. And also the authors refer specifically to Kenneth Arrow, who published a paper, then a book called Social Choice and Individual Values in 1951, which laid the groundwork for modern social choice theory. Now, I'll come back to Arrow shortly, but let's take a look at an example of Pareto efficiency in the context of Catalyst. Okay, Pareto efficiency asks that given all stakeholders' preferences, the outcome of the governance process cannot be strictly improved vis-a-vis these preferences. Now, in relation to Project Catalyst, I've adapted the author's example to something from the fund. So they suggest that Pareto Efficiency is only somewhat satisfied. For example, if the total fund is 200,000 and there are free winning proposers, theoretically, have budgets $10, $100,000 and $100,000 in order of popularity, the last proposal will not receive funding. Okay, returning back to, I'm included this in here for people might want to look at this later and to see the founding theorem of social choice theory. So that's returning to the background context. So like Condorcet, Ari was concerned with the difficulties of group decisions and the inconsistencies to where that may lead. So Arrow's impossibility theorem showed that even mild conditions of reasonableness could not be satisfied by any social choice procedure that identifies a social ordering or ranking for each cluster of individual preferences. Very briefly, I will outline Arrow's impossibility theorem to give a hint of the foundation of modern social choice theory. So, with 3 or more options, no ranked voting electoral system can convert the preferences of individuals into a community-wide, complete and transitive ranking, while also meeting the following set of criteria. Unrestricted domain, which means the universality of the ranking of preferences, that they will always be reproduced under the same conditions. Non-dictatorship, that no one voter dictates preferences or all other voters mimic one voter. Pareto efficiency, which we talked about before, that there is no unanimity of, that there is a unanimity of preferences. What any individual prefers is always reflected in the social preference order. And finally, independence of irrelevant alternatives, that a choice between A and B, for example, should not be affected by an irrelevant alternative C. Okay, moving on to the next property, which is about accountability. It's an incentive property. And this requires that all stakeholders are held accountable for the input they provide into the system. And it's defined as follows: a blockchain governance system satisfies the property of accountability if whatever participants bring in a change, they are held individually responsible for it in a clearly defined way by the platform. The authors conclude that in respect of accountability in Catalyst, there are no explicit or on-chain penalties. They note that proposers need to submit periodic progress reports about their projects to keep receiving funding, and similarly, community advisors and veteran community advisors can be penalized for poor reviews or absence. But as these are either centralized or community-driven without clearly described mechanisms, accountability is mostly not satisfied. Okay, next is related to sustainability. The sustainability properties address the issue of whether appropriate incentives are provided for the system to evolve constructively and to the stakeholders for providing meaningful input. So first of all, there's sustainable development. A blockchain governance system sustains development if it incentivizes, via monetary rewards or otherwise, participants who develop successful improvement proposals for the platform. The authors conclude that the sustainable development is satisfied in Catalyst through the funding process, although there is no explicit incentive or reward given to the proposing group or individual. It is the responsibility of the proposer to request the amount which represents the value of their work. Now, on this point, I would differ from the authors. I would suggest that simply assuming the proposer will request the value of their work is an insufficient guarantee in budgeting and whether they are granted sufficient funds. Sustainable participation. A blockchain governance system sustains participation if it incentivizes, via monetary rewards or otherwise, participants who participate in the decision-making process of the platform. The authors conclude that sustainable participation is satisfied in Catalyst as all parties are rewarded for participating in governance processes, in their view, and to an extent receive larger rewards for additional effort, e.g. community advisors and those who review quality. And here again, I would differ from the author's view. I would suggest that not all parties are rewarded for participation historically in Catalyst, specifically the group dubbed toolmakers and maintainers who provide administrative, organizational and documentational services that are only intermittently rewarded through a complete funding process, for a competitive funding process. Sorry. The next property is liveness, what they call liveness, which is the crucial ability of the system to produce outputs expediently, which is captured by the liveness property. So the way they put this is a blockchain governance system satisfies liveness if it is capable of incorporating an input of urgency from stakeholders, and then is capable of acting on that in a sense that an issue is deemed to be urgent according to some function, then the decision-making procedure is capable of terminating within a reasonable amount of time, which is the function of the urgency of that matter. So in other words, is the system able to react quickly? The authors conclude that liveliness is not satisfied, as even though Catalyst funds can be released in accordance with a proposal's progress, there's no direct mechanism to take urgent action for immediate release. Now, whether liveness is required in Catalyst relates to debates about the timeliness of funds. This issue has been identified and has led to initiatives such as the Rapid Funding Mechanism Challenge and to emerging community treasuries and stake pool networks. The final property concerns participation and eligibility, which is suffrage. So decision-making systems can produce legitimate outcomes provided they are inclusive. A property that we capture by different aspects of suffrage, suitably adapted to the blockchain setting. In the author's assessment, since voting eligibility depends on only having at least 500 ADA, token-based suffrage is what they call token-based suffrage is satisfied. There are no guaranteed voting rights based on previous positive contributions. However, community advisors and veteran community advisors can affect the outcome through their reviews. So the authors argue that meritocratic suffrage is slightly satisfied. So they make a distinction here between token suffrage, which is being able to participate at all, and meritocratic suffrage, which is being able to participate through some activity like a CA, community advisor activity, and thereby having an influence on the governance process. Okay, to summarize the assessments here. So this is a table of the author's assessment of properties in relation to Catalyst. And I've added a column of my own assessments to the right-hand side. And I'll leave it to you, maybe go away and think about, or we can discuss it, to consider your own assessment of these properties and how you think that, whether you think they are fulfilled, satisfied, not satisfied, or not. And also whether the definitions are framed in a way that is meaningful. Okay, so this presentation is funded by Project Catalyst, as I said before, in the Fund 7 QADAO Crisis Gitbook proposal, which received a CA assessment of 4.89 and was successfully voted for by 197 unique wallets last week. And please consider delegating to our pool, which is part of the Rookie network. And also there's another video taking a different view of this paper, which I recommend by QADAO on their YouTube channel, which looks at the paper from a much more tokenomics perspective. Okay, and that is it. So I just want to take it to a general discussion or any questions. I know that's quite a lot to take in. Martin.
Hey, thanks, Stephen. That was really interesting and a lot of food for thought, which I will continue in the future. I had a question though. So are you presenting this only to consider as it relates to Catalyst, to
Yeah.
Project Catalyst? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the paper, they again, it's the question of time, because although that was quite a lengthy presentation, I had to go into quite a lot of detail already. But the paper goes into a lot more, compares a lot of different blockchains, including Polkadot, and others. And that's a different aspect of the paper. So if you want to go back to the paper and look at that, like look at those properties, because the reason why they're defining the properties is to have a common standard of comparison between different blockchains. So there is that aspect, and I didn't have time to cover that.
Okay, thanks. Because it's kind of interesting, since we're talking governance, we talked about the governance issue in the town hall as well. So I'm just trying to make sure,
Yeah, what I'm doing, yeah, great. I mean, what I'm trying to do is, because I got funded for Ecrasis, which is hoping to do some education on this. It's just to see what that would look like. And obviously, it's going to be a balance between detail, how much detail you cover. Nick, you got your hand up. Do you have a question, Nick?
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Yeah.
So great. Well, thanks for the presentation. And my question was just, do you have any other links to resources where there's examples of some of these on-chain governance being implemented? I had specifically an idea, a question regarding how this could be set up in specifically for a stake pool in controlling the margin by governance by the actual delegators.
If you go to the, I'm not sure if there should be a link to the presentation in chat. I can just I'll drop that again. And I think I provided a link to the original paper in the slide presentation. Now, if you go to the original paper, and I think it's hosted on Aggelos or something, and you download the PDF, you'll find in their references at the end, links to each blockchain. I think you'll find a link to each blockchain example that they give. And then what you'll say, I suppose, if you're going to go through an exercise of, okay, you've got a stake pool, let's say you're trying to introduce governance for your stake pool according to these principles. Let's say you want to go that direction. That's what I'm hearing from you. So first of all, you would have to assess, are these principles appropriate for you? Okay, I'll leave that to you to assess, okay? Then you would see how those principles are applying to different blockchains. Yeah, because they apply them to Polkadot, I can't remember the other ones, but you could Catalyst, they apply it to Bitcoin as well. So it's all quite interesting to see how these things change, how those properties change, and what's lacking, what isn't lacking in each comparison. They do provide a useful comparison table also in the paper, which is cross references. It shows a list of the blockchains, and then on the top it shows you whether they have met certain properties or not. Now, returning to you building your governance model, I suppose you would have to design your governance model. If it has a voting system, what that looks like, if it's on chain, what parts of it are on chain, what parts of it are off chain, that kind of thing, and see how it might fit into that. And then you can also you could do your own comparison, couldn't you, between the other chains. But I will put a caveat in this is Aggelos's and Kiayias's point of view. Okay, so it does depend on whether you agree with how they're defining the properties. Sorry, Tivo, is that okay, Nick, for an answer?
Yeah, no, perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay, Tivo.
Yeah, just to add more to the examples. I think the recent thing, what I found interesting is how also the decentralized governance is decentralized, like the mana and the land, and that part is building their own DAO, which is kind of funded by venture capitalists, but they give that off the cuff opportunity to the people who are building on the like the sandbox side. And so definitely something there to look into. Then today I was introduced to Harmony One, even though my team got funded there, but they also have like a venture capital site where they select the proposals themselves, but they have it all on the chain and they bring in. And recent research also into Colony. If I don't know if it's just called Colony, but they pretty much have also a platform where you just bring in a community and they create their own governance structure based on sentiments, and they're trying to make the consent-based version.
Yeah. I mean, it occurred to me, Tivo, that you could do a kind of mini proposal workshop. But if you took the properties, like you're talking about what Nick just asked, you see, because essentially what they've done, they've provided a framework for what a governance chain should look like. Yeah. So imagine you had that as a kind of process in a workshop, like a mini proposal workshop. You would say, does it meet this property? Does it make this property? Does it meet this property? That kind of thing. And then you could have like a workflow that would run through that. So that might be something to think about for the future.
Yeah, then this is definitely going to decide what in the long term I want to do, but I see it's like a step-by-step basis, because going through all of this at once is not possible. As you saw you right now, presenting this already takes like an entire hour and to digest that information, and even to start implementing governance decisions on each of the stages and using perhaps the catalyst as a reference. It is a lot of hours and manpower to like even go through this, but I do like the sentiment that and this is, I'm actively actually working on something like that, and this research is showing me added a new level of what I didn't even think about, like confidentiality and verifiability. I was like, just let's put things together, which is just better idea scale, better than Discord, a bit of social media here, a bit of websites here, and then put some tools together to make like a cohesive platform. But now, like, then to have this aspect of, but this is missing, like the confidentiality is now missing if I do these things, and like how will the community align with these kinds of vision if it's built like how do you say, like a test instead of like a real, or like let's do it first time and the correct way possible.
Sophie, you still got your hand up. Do you have another question? Just checking.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to add to the discussion and your prompt, but also thanks for organizing this. I understand it takes some effort as well. And I had missed this paper completely, but it's pretty interesting. And I think you're also pointing that out already a bit, but I kind of also have to agree that definitely on point 7 and 8 is sort of like, but then I took a look at the definition as well, but then for 7 it's very, right, it's only one little block of text, and then you could argue that if there is any developer who has been rewarded for their contributions, then it satisfies number 7. But then is that enough, right? So it's maybe, I think it's a nice setup, but it definitely would require quite some more nuance to sort of capture a lot of things. And there's some angles that I feel are a bit missing as well, about like people being involved in the decisions that affect them and having a reasonable say in them. Right? That is something that in a lot of self-organizing governance systems or literature that I know about, that is usually a pretty strongly emphasized, that is quite important. But that seems to not be very present here.
I agree, actually, and I found that, I mean, I've been working on this for a few weeks. The main problem I found, and I haven't really succeeded very well, is because I was trying to take one aspect of the paper and then reduce that down as much as possible. And as is apparent, it still takes a lot of time. to cover that framework. And maybe going through this and also thinking about it, maybe what we're discussing with TiVo, there may be a better way of taking those properties and then looking at them as a framework in general. But as you say, Sophie, if you look at what's also interesting for this paper is that it reveals intellectual background, like where IOG are coming from, which is why I spent so much time on social choice theory. And if you look at the history of social choice theory from the 50s, it's not just Aggelos's approach or Kiayias' approach. That approach is very much related to just voting, a very deterministic approach, so it relies on very tightly defined functions. And in the context of IOG, there's a good reason for that, and that's particularly for the first instance to make sure you have a secure blockchain governance system in terms of, you know, the wallets and the voting on chain, all that kind of stuff, and or any technical parameter changes. But as you get into governance, what you might call human governance, if you look back at social choice theory, there's a figure called Amartya Sen, who looks at what happens in between voting. Okay, so voting doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's a culture of decision-making process that people go through in order to say, well, what are we voting for? You know, so, and that is where I hear what may be lacking here. And there's ways of, I mean, the jargon that they use in social choice is taking individual preferences and aggregating them in what they call societal preferences. But you don't, and you can do that very quantitatively and very mathematically and very narrowly in terms of, you know, this is what an individual preference means. It only means this. It doesn't mean anything else. And that kind of contextualizes individual choice and maybe arguably in a very narrow way, you know. So there's all these sort of philosophical issues as well in the background.
Yeah, and I haven't had the chance to go through it thoroughly, but I have the feeling that there's a certain angle, like you say, of research that is somewhat missing from this, and indeed it's in that communication layer, the human layer, right? Because the whole prisoner's dilemma, you can overcome it if you have iterative phases and communication in between, right? You can achieve the Pareto efficiency.
Yeah.
Right, but you need the communication layer, and it has nothing to do with like the actual voting systems or
yeah, I mean, I could talk about different aspects. The reason why I put different things in the paper was to plant ideas in people's heads. And I recommend, if you're interested in a part of the slide, go away and read about it. Because, for example, the impossibility theorem, which is one of the founding theorems of social choice theory, is based on, people have argued it's based on a kind of skewed view of choice, because it's based on choice ranking. And there's kind of been a lot of solutions given to the impossibility theorem, which obviously depends on, so for example, Amartya Sen argues that it's about how you define what's called the utility of someone's choice versus non-utility choices. So Sophie, things like soft aspects of people's situations, like their culture, for example, could be not accounted for because they're seen as non-utility functions, which is a bit dismissive, whereas utility functions could be included just because they're quantifiable. So there's this kind of issue, right, related. You know, you could create models which in the jargon are referred to as non-utility functions, which, but to you and me, could be very meaningful. Like, for example, what culture do you come from? What are your beliefs about certain ethical issues? That kind of thing.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for the presentation, first of all.
Yeah.
It was great to listen to your presentation. I have a question about your findings, actually, maybe related to that. You know, in this last funding process, I was really surprised that one of the challenge, which we call as Cardano for climate, get one of the most downvoted. So it was really surprising that to see such kind of thing, because this is not a this is a challenge, right? It's not a proposal to get funded and use the treasury, but this is open to everyone. And as you identified, that sustainable development could be leveraged throughout blockchain governance. And I was surprised at why this was not leveraged by Cardano community. And
I would suggest that, I mean, Sophie's just put in chat the answer, well, one of the answer was that, you know, it's a communications issue, partly. Also, and I don't want to get into the politics of this particularly, but let's say, so, you know, it's about who has a platform to communicate their choices. And this came out recently in the past few weeks, okay, like particularly who on social media, for example, or who has a presence on town hall and can say, and this can be very subtle, okay? So you can say, oh, I think challenges that serve developers should be voted for example. You can say that, that's fine. Also, the Cardano Foundation came out and has started to vote on challenges as well. But what the Cardano Foundation explicitly said was that they wouldn't downvote things. And this is where it gets political, because the reason why they don't want to be seen to downvote something is because if you downvote something, that's like a political signal. It's saying we don't support this challenge. Now, also, as Sophie's saying, I don't want to speak for Sophie, but in this communication aspect of things, just because the wider world may be more concerned, say, with climate change or with Latin American challenges, that kind of thing, you know, there is that wider world, but that wider world is not represented necessarily in the voters, the people who vote. Okay, because first of all, not everyone votes. Okay, and of the people who do vote, not all of them are informed. There's a lot of data done by, I think, some Yuta of Eastern Town Hall or Japan, which shows that people don't really make much research in terms of voting. Okay, so most people don't really know what they're voting for. That's a bit of an extreme way of putting it, but there is that aspect, and that's partly to do with the scaling issue as well, because as there's more things to vote for, it becomes more of a chore, you know, to make a decision. Yeah. Now, as you say, you make a distinction between proposals and challenges. There's less challenges, so it should be more apparent, shouldn't it? That you, okay, and it was very disappointing to see things that have been politicized, like climate change, or I think diversity in women was actually got a negative vote, for example. Yeah. And that shows there's a kind of systematic behavior from a section of the community who don't want to see that challenge succeed. That is really what's happened there. Same with, to a certain extent, with climate change. So it's just a product of there is a politics going on in our community, whether we like it or not. You know, so the solution to that might be, how do you communicate a challenge? Okay, how do you make it non-political, if you can, you know, and try and, I mean, one line of argument to say, I mean, I don't want to get on either side, you know, you could say that it's not all about development, or development is included in, for example, the Latin American challenge and that kind of thing. So again, it depends on strategy, and we're getting into that arena now. It's my view.
Yeah, interesting.
But I'd like to hear what you say, Sophie, on that.
Yeah, I think it's different things, right? And it is politics. Maybe it's also some people's intentions or their idea of what is going to be best for them, right? Maybe they have a lot of ADA and they wanted to go to the moon, and then you want DeFi or something like that. And there could be some of that, but there's also the additional layer of whatever the choice is. Like if I go into the app, there's so many proposals to choose from, right? I have to put my attention somewhere. But if I know that like all of the people that I care for in the community are all going to vote yes on this one proposal, and I'm probably also gonna go in there and vote for that proposal. I'm not voting yes because they say yes, but I'm actually doing the voting, right? I'm paying attention to the proposal because I know, like, hey, if we all get together and we vote yes, we can get this in, right? Sort of like, I know it's going to be effective because I know other people are joining in, and that is the power of communication. If I know everybody is going to vote the right way, I have more incentive to vote the right way because it's going to have an effect. Right, your vote has very little power, but if we all communicate about how we're going to vote, we could vote like a wheel, right?
Do you see my point now? Why I was talking about Amita Sin, because Amita Sin talks about what happens between voting. Okay, that's the critical thing. So, and what happens? Think of it in terms of catalysts. Okay, when we vote. Okay, what happens between we voting? No, that is going to, what Amita Sin would say is, where is the culture of decision making? Okay, where is the culture of being informed about decision making? Okay, and knowing, having, and that is mainly what's breaking down here. Possibly is that what's happened is camps have emerged, which are maybe, I suppose you could also attribute that, as you point out, Sophie, to self-interest as well. But it starts to focus on what happens in between the voting. TV, got your hand up.
Yeah, on the, adding on what Steven said, that voting is hard, and that one thing where it leads is also like a representative. So right now we don't have delegating voting, but we still look for somebody. Oh, I know Steven is smart. He probably, if he says that he's gonna vote on that or he's gonna do work on that, I'm probably gonna align with his thoughts. And when I do this voting and I remember like some statements or proposals click, I'm most likely to vote on that. And same way happens with the people who look for representatives who give the list of don't vote for that. So they have the same effect. And it's like an iterative process where you as a first timer or as a voter, you come into the system, you're overwhelmed with all of that information. Then you find out that, oh my God, I need to vote. Okay, but you want to give the participation, you kind of like get into that, do some decisions, but then you find like, okay, I need that information faster. Then you go like social media, and first people what you get accustomed are the people who are influencers. Like, oh, you see that they have thousands of followers, they have a lot of work behind them, and they do actually a good work. And then you will start like using them as a reference point. And after you do this, you might find like right now we are actually creating the counter political argument, like why this decision was bad. But this reflection might come in the first wave. It might be like 3 or 6 months later. It's like the butterfly effect comes back to you. Oh, this person whose information I take as a pure value is not maybe, it doesn't align me at that much. But this like decision making comes later. Okay, now I'm gonna look at these kinds of representatives, or they like know who to look for or who to delegate to. Is just a long arc like decision making. And
yeah, and also can have unexpected consequences. Like let's think of the property, which I think it was in the later part, sustainable participation. Okay, so and I remember working with you, Tivo, early on, where we're funded now for something, so we do get some income now, not a great deal, but whereas about 6 months ago we were doing all this for nothing, you know. And we had a lot of discussions about 6 months ago about sustainability, because it's very difficult to do this level of work and get nothing for it. Then we get into a situation where you're funded, you know, and that can have an unexpected outcome, because it kind of makes the people who are funded successful. Okay, and if they're good at what they do and they have the capability of what they do, that may act as a disincentive, ironically, to new people who come along, to people who come into the system. They come into the system and they say, oh, look at all these people who've been funded. And these people who've been funded, like me and Tivo, might have only been funded in the past 6 months, but to a new person, it looks like, oh, old school, you know, kind of thing. And that's a problem of sustainable participation, because where's the incentives there? Where, for the newcomers, I mean, you know, if you're coming new into the system, what is a new person going to look for? They're going to look for, what can I do here? Where can I fit in? Where can I participate? Where are the incentives that are relevant to us? You know, and there are some ready-made incentives that are built in, like the community advisor. So that's a very good starting point, but that's not necessarily for everyone.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I think it's very important if we're building this kind of decentralized ecosystem, because like when you start out, you start at the bottom, right? And there is a certain hierarchy, there is a authority, and at the start it was like the community was just flat, and you had IOG, so the community was kind of kicking against the authority of IOG, looking up only. But before you know it, you're actually already a couple steps up, and there's people behind you. And if you don't train yourself to constantly look back and to make sure that you're, you know, not creating a new gap, and you keep taking people along, yeah, I think that's very important that we're aware of that, and also have a discussion about that, like be honest to each other when maybe because we're going to do it accidentally, right? We do it unintentionally. We do it with the best intentions to create clarity for the community, to help out, and then all of a sudden you have a position of power just because of your reputation, even.
Yeah, and also particularly in a system that is scaling, yeah, because, and also expanding globally, for example, we start off with quite narrow representations of the world, even within the different countries that we represent, you know, and, you know, so, and also what we're good at, okay, we may think we're good at that, but we're just the best people who are here. You know, there's probably other people who come along who might be better than us, for example, but where's the opportunity for them? That's the kind of thing to consider. And I suppose the answers to that are, there's some obvious things that can help with that, like having a kind of iteration built in so that people can't have permanent positions, that kind of thing, or have to constantly, but this can be a burden as well, have to constantly prove themselves. Again, there's a balance there. So it's like every well, we had this conversation at IJP with Circle, funny enough, where when we were discussing term lengths, you know, because you go into Canada Circle, and I was a Circle rep for version 2, and you start to learn the ropes. And then by the time you've learned the ropes, it's nearly over, you know. So by the time you could be effective, it's nearly over. And so the argument is you could extend that to 6 months to be much more effective. But then if you extend it to 6 months, the counter argument to that is, well, that starts to institutionalize, it starts to embed authority. You know, so these things are all quite difficult issues to deal with, and there's not one answer, you know. Thanks, Lisa. How did the CA meeting go, Kenrick? You're on mute, something.
Excellent. Yeah, it went very well. So we introduced Nadia, and she's going to hold another meeting next week to kind of start diving into the processes for Fund 8 and beyond.
We kind of think we're kind of winding down. I kind of presented.
Yeah, I understood that. I just thought I'd come in.
Yeah, no, I kind of did a quick. I just took that paper. You've read the paper, haven't you?
Yeah, it's fantastic paper. So it's nice to that you went over it. I think that's a great thing for the community to be digging into and providing feedback on.
Yeah, I mean, it's really important to try and, I suppose what I'm thinking of, it's really important to try and take even these academic papers and try and break them down to try and communicate them to as wide as audience as possible. You know, so that's the idea. But that's quite tricky. As well. for the communication aspect of it. Yeah. But yeah, it's great to see Nadia in the CA role. Does anyone here have any more? Hi, Derek.
Unmute myself. Hello, everyone.
Hi, Derek. Good to see you.
Nice. Yeah. Nadia, she's really excited. I'm actually Derek. I'm Nadia's husband, so it's really exciting.
Excellent. Nice to meet you, Derek. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm sorry, my mail just got like dropped through the door. Normally, I listen. I've been listening to all these IOHK weekly town halls on the YouTube channel actually, and this was my first time. I thought last week I was like, all right, I'll get into it and be on the participation side of it this time. And it's nice because I guess the YouTube link for this week broke or something. It broke down.
Yeah.
So I've been able to see it anyway. Yeah, I think that the thing that I guess I feel as being somebody to kind of just as an observer through the process of Catalyst forming, Cardano itself, Catalyst, this whole Daedalus, the Catalyst. And I think that right now what I see happening as far as the conversations is it could be a lot. It's like, oh, well, it started by IOHK, IOG, and then now we need to give it to the community and all this stuff. And I guess that was their intention. That's what they intended to build. They intended to build something that we discussed that's unique. It has never been achieved throughout humanity, right? Something we've been trying to achieve. Blockchain really did that help, but I don't understand. I think that instead of thinking, man, we need to take all the power away from IOHK, and in a way we should keep the respect and keep the, the acknowledgement that they did build this.
Oh yeah.
And as much as we want to be like, let's go and whatever, and take it away, there's got to be that remembrance, I think, and that acknowledgement of making that Herculean step, and also knowing that they were going to give it to the world and give it to us, the community members. And that must have been something, a random thing I can't imagine. And now I can, because of, I guess, Cardano's leadership, but I couldn't have imagined building something that really didn't benefit me the whole time, that I was going to just completely give away, and now I'm like, oh, well, I'm like, my mind runs with, well, what can I build and give away?
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, sometimes because Catalyst, I'm just talking about Project Catalyst. Catalyst is just a part of this. So Catalyst is the part is very much to do with giving stuff away, if you like, because that's what it's all about. It's about a distributed treasury system, and why do we have a distributed in order to transfer governance to a community, a distributed community based on. Now there's a huge other part of Cardano, which is doing a lot of the development of the on-chain. I think it's covered a lot of it. That there's a separate initiative ultimately over a much longer roadmap to decentralize that through something called DCF. I can't remember what DCF stands for. Can you remember, Kenrick? Decentralized
Consortium Fund.
Yeah. And that's been run by...
Say it again, Thibaut, I didn't hear.
Decentralized Consortium Fund.
Okay. Consortium or core? I thought it was core.
I think it's consortium.
Consortium.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what that's doing, Derek, is it's led by a guy called Johnny Nigel, who's looking at all the stuff that IOG have built, like all the tech stuff, all the development stuff, and trying to open source that. And I think Charles did a keynote about open source a few times. I think he's done some AMAs about open source as well. So it's that whole other direction. The Catalyst is just a little part of that, if you like, a little part of the whole thing.
A massive web. It's a massive protocol.
Yeah. But it's really interesting. But sometimes people get the wrong impression, because if you just look at Catalyst, you might get the impression that it's all about let's take everything to the community as quickly as possible. But that's just Catalyst, I would suggest, mostly.
I think there could be a little bit of that ambiguity also with the Cardano Foundation. You don't necessarily, I think, as a general ADA holder, recognize that they are really part of Cardano, until you get into if you're watching the AMAs or whatever. But for a while, I just participated from the sidelines. And I think most of the people who are voting, like, why didn't, funding Cardano for what was it, the energy one that we were talking about? It's like, I'm drawing a blank on it.
Climate change.
Yeah, for
Climate
climate
change.
I voted for that. And it was like, and as I'm voting for it, I'm thinking, man, like, this is a no-brainer. And yeah, there's a lot of, I think this whole protocol is going to change the way people compete. I guess like the way that competitiveness occurs now will be different, so it'll I guess up level the way people have to compete for things and focus on little nuanced niches where, every part of technology is going to have to get upgraded. So I think there might be space for people for the next decade or so to have space to I guess produce, develop.
I mean, today's presentation, I'm not sure if you saw today's presentation by Dor and others, which is about this the new liquid democracy and everything. But the competition, okay, I would suggest that the default position tends to be competition, and this, I'm not sure if Kenrick would agree with this or not, but what some people are seeing in capitalist as is a kind of a competitive direction by the nature of the system. And it's interesting the language that was used by Daniel in the presentation when he talked about non-competitiveness, trying to encourage a non-competitive environment. I think you posted in comments, Kenrick, that if you want a non-competitive environment, you have to work at it. It's not something that's just going to happen, because the world, the old world, if you like I'm talking about the old world of finance, fiat and all that sort of stuff, is very competitively driven, and partly because of the structural nature of that. Now we have an opportunity to create our own structure, and that's where I think we may need to intervene in terms of delegated voting and things like that. I'll see what you have to say about that, Kenrick.
Well, yeah, and building on both of your comments, what I would say is there's a lot of aspirational language, but actually achieving these things, I think we have to be really grounded in kind of measuring what we're really doing, and not just relying on kind of aspirational language and then sort of just trusting that that's how people are going to behave and that's how things are going to actually evolve. So, there's still a lot of competition in the Catalyst program, and people get hurt too. Like I know I talked to a proposer who felt that his work had been plagiarized, right? Because it's all open. So, one potentially winning strategy is to read the proposals early and then, write your own proposal building on that, but with some improvements and modifications. So I'm kind of I'm interested to see how the delegated representatives works out. I'm interested in participating since I've been very active, in being part of the Catalyst program, but I still have some skepticism, particularly around the use of the word liquid democracy, because I'm not sure that what you achieve with the current voting mechanism where it's weighted by ADA actually leads to what is known as liquid democracy. To me, that's an open question. And I haven't seen analysis on it yet. But I want to learn more. I want to understand more. There were a lot of,
No, I mean, I imagine there's some academic literature on liquid democracy, which we're all going to have to dive into now, and do some reading, and then correlate that with what Aggelos, Kiayias' paper and everything else, because there's going to be, and also what I mean, some of us are involved in something called community governance oversight, which is again, which came out of the liaison with IOG in anticipation of some of the volatile catalyst parameter changes. So what that basically, and that was funded, and I helped draft that proposal to oversee for a body of the community to oversee parameter changes. So which is this kind of like works in parallel with what DAW is announcing today. But then the question with liquid democracy, for example, the immediate question that occurred to me, Kenrick, is, well, can an oversight person stand for that position? For example, probably not, because someone involved in community governance oversight is going to oversee that. So there's a kind of, we're going to have to figure things like that out.
Right.
And also what's involved in liquid democracy and that D, whatever, was it called D something? The
Delegated representative?
D-rep, yeah.
D-rep, yeah.
So we need to, again, it's coming out of Voltaire brainstorming on liquid democracy. So we need to see what that means, how it's going to be structured, how it's going to fit into decision making, that kind of thing. So yeah, so there's a lot of issues it raises.
Yeah, I mean, I keep hammering on this, but we proposed in Fund 4 this diversified voting influence proposal, and that came out of our experience in modeling complex systems and the challenges you face when distributions are power law. What I didn't know until I had done the research is that it goes back to the 1950s when Penrose made the discovery that as you correlate votes, your voting influence increases by a squared term. And so I think there still seems to be immaturity about how that impacts things, even among people who are designing these voting processes, and they don't realize how critical that point is and how it undermines your best intentions. So for instance, as Dora was talking about the fact that this group of representatives are going to work together as a team, well, that's even more correlation. So now if you're a single voter, right, you really, they're leaving open the option of voting directly, right? But not actually, because, for anyone has something like the median or the mean value of ADA, your vote is going to get washed out and not be relevant towards the final decisions given these large pools. And now if those large pools are going to kind of intentionally be organized through conversations and through planning, then there's another layer of correlation in the voting outcomes. So there's deep challenges in that. Like I see the potential for it, and there may be some good things that come out of it, but
what interests me, Cameron,
I haven't seen enough analysis yet, I guess is my point, to really be convinced about what the outcome is going to be and how this is going to actually work.
I mean, it's almost certainly going to be wrong the first time you implement it. So what interests me is how you test it, Kenrick. So so, and that's what community governance oversight should be about. Is looking at, okay, you've got this liquid democracy model, and to be fair to Dor, he was saying that in the presentation, wasn't he? He was saying this is going to take some time, we're going to do this bit by bit, all that kind of thing, so there's a couple of immediate questions to come to mind. Is like, what is a D-rep? Is that representing what are they representing exactly? Because that I haven't got quite that clear in my mind, because you can represent a constituency, for example, or you can represent a decision, a kind of like a decision, a category of decision making, put it that way, like expertise, or you can represent a community, for example. That's another kind of representation. So what are they representing, that kind of thing? And it sounds like more on the decision making side to me, but I guess I'm just guessing that because of the social choice direction that people like Aggelos come from, which definitely seems to be very much orientated towards let's aggregate choice decision making in terms of, you know, individuals versus societal preferences, rather than let's represent a community. I don't think of it in those terms at all, you know. So, and maybe I'm not saying they should or shouldn't, that's just how it is, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah. And then there's a question of, well, how are you going to test it? You know, so what are they? What's the first thing you're going to test it on? I suppose that's my question. But go ahead.
Well, I could like in terms of testing, like these are the kinds of questions that come to my mind and where I have concerns. And addressing what Tivo said in the chat is that, and this is actually in Aggelos' paper too, that if there's public knowledge about who's voting, then there's the opportunity to kind of bribe or somehow corrupt that person, you know?
Yeah.
So this is part of why keeping votes secret is important. However,
well, yeah,
let me finish though, because there's another side. Let me finish and then yeah. So then there's another side to it, that given that votes are weighted by the amount of ADA you have, then the secrecy causes a problem in that you don't have transparency about who's the actual dominant influencers on the decisions. Now, in my mind, I mean, this is what has to be looked at. I don't know the answer to this, but these are the kinds of fears I have, is that it could maximize corruption in the following sense, that, you know, the pools are public, so now they can be corrupted because of the public role that they serve. At the same time, the real power is still secret, because, you know, you can keep secret how much ADA you have. And now you kind of, you know, that secret power has the ability to kind of target these representatives. So those are the kinds of things that I think have to be looked at in a real way.
Yeah, I agree.
Ensure the integrity of the process.
I agree, and that particularly relates to, because well, there's something that didn't occur to me, whether there's going to be on-chain voting or what doesn't matter, what kind of voting system there's going to be of the D-reps. But then there's the issue itself of, again, it's about the continuum of what is appropriate form of voting system considering the nature of the decision-making context. So one example that's given is if you're making a committee decision, for example, then the argument might say, well, that should be transparent. You should know who in that committee is voting for what, for transparency and for accountability, because they are the representatives to that committee. Let's say they have put themselves forward. They could, by doing that, there's the risk that they could be bribed, and manipulated. But then there's also, that's kind of offset by being public as well, you know, because if they are bribed, you have to hide that kind of thing. Whereas with mass voting, it's much more, if like thousands of people vote, then a lot of people will want to be anonymous, don't they? They don't want to be identified in a decision making. So there's a kind of continuum between between that situation and what might be called a committee situation. Sorry, Sophie, hand up.
That's okay. It was giving me some time to process some of those thoughts as well. But one thing that I'm kind of like worried about with this direction is not so much the implementation, but I think because like we're moving in some directions, or we have like the same intention, but we can only like try out so many things at the same time, and especially with the current configuration, because we have basically one experiment, right? And you can run it in one experiment and then do one change, but it's like, okay, we're gonna do DREP, but then for everything, right? The proposals and the decisions for the things on chain, right? And it's like, and all of that is all with with ADA, right? So the distribution of ADA governs everything. Doesn't matter what kind of system you introduce, whether it's reps or not, because yeah, it's still it's all in one system, right? So whatever change you make affects everything. And I think that, yeah, although like Catalyst is set up as an experiment, there's still sort of a limit in how much experimentation we can actually do, because it is connected to the real distribution of ADA, right? We can't, oh, let's experiment with the distribution for a bit and see how that works, right? That's not a parameter we can tweak. And if we're gonna do things like derep and experiment with that, I think we do need to have the freedom to kind of play with those parameters as well. But that's more what I mean with the route. It's like, yeah, but that's like a whole different, but then you're introducing an extra layer because this is already an experiment. Do we then need to branch and have like feature branches off the main experiment and do like sub experiments and then come back into the main one? Maybe, but that also adds a lot of complexity.
I mean, you picked up on a point which I really wanted to expand on. There's a lot of points I wanted to expand on in the presentation, but I couldn't. And one is token-based suffrage, which they say mostly is satisfied. And I said, doesn't really, it slightly satisfies issues around suffrage. Like, in other words, if you have, okay, you only need 580 to vote, but it doesn't, what the paper doesn't say, it's referred to, is voting power. And I'd be interested to hear what Kenrick has to say about this, because I was trying, I mean, I'd like to know the source, the rationale for voting power. I know there is a rationale for voting power, Kenrick. There's
well, yeah,
yeah.
It's not a trivial thing to measure. And in fact, with the scientists who worked with me on it, you know, kind of explained that it's only kind of at the limits that you can get good approximations. But the principle is the following, that if you do kind of an experiment and you think about doing all possible experiments, your voting power is the probability that your vote would be decisive in changing the outcome of the election. And it was through doing those kind of studies that Penrose discovered that as you, the more votes you can correlate, for instance, by having ADA in your wallet, that the probability that you'll be the decisive vote increases quadratically. And yet we all think linearly. So we kind of think, oh yeah, you know, this is an economic system. And so, you know, if you just weight it by the number of ADA, then that's a fair thing. And everyone gets to participate and everyone gets to weight their vote by the number of ADA. But that's not how the decisions get made. You know, the decisions are getting made by are influenced by how correlated those votes are. And every wallet that has the same, you know, every wallet is a set of correlated ADA. And then if you have a consortium of people who kind of work together to decide what they're going to vote on, that's an even stronger correlation. You know,
IOG pushed back, and they said that I was trying to find the source of this, that because there's that constant refrain, why isn't there one person, one vote in Catalyst? And the constant response from IOG that I hear is often Sybil resistance, security concerns, this kind of thing. And
yeah, so
where is that coming from, Kenrick?
Well, I want to be clear. I've never been, and I am not an advocate of one person, one vote. I don't think that would work in, you know, for this kind of system where it is principally an economic system and your ownership is important, and there should be some weight to that ownership. What I was trying to get at is the heart of what I was trying to see. This is the way I think about it. When you measure the total votes, that's equivalent to measuring the mean of the votes, right? But because you have power laws in power laws, actually, for extreme power laws, the mean isn't even definable, right? Because the mean ends up getting completely dominated by the highest wallets. If you could figure out a way where the weighting of the voting outcome was more controlled by the mean of the median rather than the mean. The median is a more stable, more robust metric. But how you design a voting mechanism that would be weighted by the median is a hard problem. And even the solutions we came up with or recommended, you know, in the pushback IOG will give is that there is a necessary component that you have some sort of digital identity. Because all you have to do, if you're one person with a lot of ADA, all you have to do is split your ADA into many wallets and make that seem like many people. And all of a sudden, you know, you've kind of counteracted whatever non-linear weighting you've introduced. So that's why it's a hard problem. But nevertheless, I think that's a problem that has to be taken seriously. And you shouldn't be saying that you're a decentralized voting process. You shouldn't be saying that you're a democracy until you've worked out some solutions to that problem.
Yeah, I suppose I hear that, and I hear because you're coming very much from a phototric defense of quadratic. I know it's not. I know there are. It's not. It's a hard problem. I suppose I'm thinking of what, because you did say before that you don't support one person, one vote. Yeah. Now,
Right.
what I'm interested in is how to. Now, I haven't really looked into. I'm trying to source the reason why one person, one vote is insecure, for example, or difficult to secure, that one. And secondly, I'm also interested in your point about why isn't that desirable otherwise as well? What's the other reasons why one person, one vote is not desirable?
Well, and if Sophie wants to go first, I'm happy to answer, but I don't want to dominate the conversation either. So maybe Sophie can go first and then I can come back to answering that.
Okay.
I can give at least some reason why one person one vote has some downsides, but that's it. And in the end, like I'll look for a link, but there's no optimal voting system, right? That it doesn't exist. There's no complete fair, like there's always some criteria that you're gonna lack on. And you can find these examples. For example, if we all have one vote and we're voting between a list of options, then maybe we all have the same second option, right? But different first options. But then the second option is probably the best for the whole group, right? But that's never going to be the top ranking one, right? If we only have one vote, because we can't vote for a second pick. So if it's one person, 10 votes, that's already a very different, you get very different results than if it's one person, one vote, right? So even that can already be different. And then I agree as well with Kenrick that there is definitely, especially in these kind of systems, some argument to make to skin in the game. Like we are a stake system, you have to have some stake. Now, if that stake is something that you can completely get with just financial resources, just buy it straight up, that is maybe a different argument, right? And maybe the governance layer of certain decisions, right? Maybe some decisions you can, and maybe other decisions you need another layer token that you can get maybe through participation and finance, or only through participation, or through other people granting you that access. But that's some things, and there's some situations definitely where one person, one vote is also good enough. But think we need like a multi-layer. We need not one voting system for every decision, but we need to find which system works for what. Like maybe for challenge settings, we need conviction voting, right? Where we can continually change how much we are allocating to each category. So it's more flowing, right? Instead of all or nothing, the category is there or it just disappears, right? And that maybe that doesn't really work for something like that.
I hear what you're saying, Sophie, about how one person, I'll get back to you, Cameron, very quickly. How one person, one vote leads to distortions in terms of like, and that again is like the impossibility theorem of Kenneth Arrow, where, but that's based on ranked systems. So there's also a possibility, there's been solutions to the impossibility theorem by tweaking the ranking of the system, by having different kinds of systems. I would say that. And then what else you were saying is also fitting into what's called in the paper meritocratic suffrage. So where basically your reputation or your contribution is giving you some governance power, if you like, some sort of influence, like the CAs, for example. They have meritocratic suffrage arguably because they contribute to deciding which proposals should go forward or not. Over to you, Cameron.
Well, yeah, I'm just commenting on several of these things. Before I even start, I'll say I do recommend the papers written by Vitalik Buterin, founder of the Theorem, and a lot of his blog posts. He in the cryptocurrency community, he has some of the best writing on these issues, and the Theorem has also been working at these hard and trying to come up with solutions. And in fact, his most recent either paper or blog was titled something like Proof of Soul, and which is related to proof of humanity. That's what he meant, proof of humanity. So the way I think about it is that in building these decentralized communities, you're really trying to achieve something in between democracy and the corporate model. So democracy is kind of a one person, one vote model, and it's about the whole community. And part of why that's important is because you don't really have a choice. You're going to be governed, and so the point is, if you're going to be governed, you should have an equal vote with everyone else. Whereas, at least right now, any of these cryptocurrencies are really voluntary, whether you want to hold that asset and participate in this economic system. And so that's that has to balance some of the issues that, the corporate model is that it's basically private. Even if it's a public company, it's still, into people that own stock. And in those corporate models, it's a one stock, one vote model for governance. But with the decentralized autonomous communities, you're trying to do something in between that. And that's why there's a need for some kind of modified voting mechanism. And a last comment I'll make, I've been starting to attend the meetings with the Radical Exchange community that was founded by Weil and Vitalik Buterin. And Weil commented that there's a lot of legislators around the world are looking at these cryptocurrencies and trying to make determinations about what is truly decentralized and what a definition of decentralized is. And the governance may be part of that evaluation. And, and of course, he comes from the point of view as the inventor of the quadratic voting model. But part of what he was saying is that if the model of voting is one coin, one vote, that may not qualify as a decentralized community, because that is more of a private corporate model.
It's also quite interesting because it speaks to the nature of suffrage. So arguably general suffrage, like one person, one vote, in the kind of national voting systems, like, for example, it's accidental. You just happen to be an American, you happen to be in this country. Tough. You have to vote like in American, you have to vote like a UK national. And that makes that already means that you're kind of, you don't have skin in the game. You have some givens, like you have to pay tax, etc., or you, depending on that kind of thing. Whereas blockchain governance is like a discrete form of suffrage. It's like it's almost like a product on the shelf, isn't it? It's like,
yeah, exactly. You have a choice whether to participate or not.
Yeah, you can see, here's this, let's say in the future you can choose governance. So on the shelf is Polkadot, and on another shelf is Cardano. Let's say, you know, and you choose one of those, and that gives you your governance system, that gives you your suffrage system, you know. And because it's a product in that sense, it's, well, product is the wrong word for it. I would say discrete. It's self-contained. It's self-contained.
Yeah. And also kind of building on what Sophie was saying is that I actually do think I don't know if this is possible, but if, for instance, with the Catalyst program, there could be a kind of split where part of the program is still governed in the way we're currently doing it, where everyone votes directly.
Right.
And part of it was done in this new delegated representatives. And then you had the chance to actually compare the outcomes and do some analysis of what the benefits and costs are of each of them. You'd learn more. You'd learn more.
What's it called in experimental terms, where you have, you know, you keep one thing the same, I can't remember.
Like a control, right?
A control subject, I completely agree with that. Yeah, completely. Sophie, do you want to say something on that?
Oh yeah, I was gonna do the thumbs up, but then it turned into a raised hand. But yeah, I think that sort of creating that experimental ground and limiting the parameters. I think
I'm interested in Daniel's view, but I imagine there's some overhead. If you had a control group, if you're trying to introduce say D reps, Daniel, and then you have a control group, then you could have an enormous overhead, aren't you? Because you're going to have to run two systems in parallel. So presumably you just have to go with one system.
I joined it a little later on the conversation, so probably an hour late and probably a lot of insights that I've missed, but we just channeled over from the challenge setting room as such. But yeah, I'm excited to see where this leads to. It's the first iteration. It's the first playing of the delegation system and those delegate representatives. And the blog post will be coming up midday tomorrow, I believe. So that will have a lot more clarity on like how different pieces fit together. But, you know, it's a step number one. So there'll be lots of like additional insights coming along as we are launching that, and sort of like learning as we're going as well, and applying those concepts together with that first cohort of the D-reps that will be very pivotal in actually giving that real-time haptic feedback. Like, does it actually make sense what we're doing? And does it work as we think as well as it's doing? So quite excited.
Well, and the question, Danny, was, is there, and Sophie was good in sort of bringing this up as a possibility, is there a possibility of kind of having part of the program continue to run the way we are doing and part of the program under the D-rep, so you could have a comparison of how the outcomes are? Is that a possibility?
Possibility, yes. Practicality in making that actually happen and not divide the attention so early on. Now it makes sense in terms of the overheads comment that Stephen was saying. It's probably not doable in those practical sense, right? We will have a hybrid situation where you will have that cohort of D-reps, right? But because being a D-rep does not mean that that's the only way to go forward, because you will be able, you know, it will be like that absolute liquid option that you can withdraw the delegation at any point if you start disagreeing, or if you find someone else, or maybe if you become a D-rep yourself. But there'll be like possibilities of being you as a direct and making the choices, or delegating your option or part of it. You know, when you'll be able to actually split that voting power, you will be able perhaps, okay, I will give my 50% of voting power to a D-rep, but I'm going to maintain my 50% of the power. So maybe if we are thinking about those terms, that potentially could be a way. Having like a completely two separate things at the present time, I think it would be challenging.
Yeah.
Just
And we'll
trying
have
to
the-
get us to a point where we are comfortable with at least shipping something as such.
Yeah, I mean, and we'll have, of course, we'll have the history that of what we've been through this past year. So that
For
can
sure.
be a comparison. But I will say, to me, the option of directly voting, it's a facade. You're not going to have any influence at that point unless you're one of the wealthiest members of the community. And so, because again, voting power does not grow. That would only be true if it was linear. And so the key to having some influence is the ability to correlate your votes. And you correlate your votes either by holding a lot of ADA or by being part of a consortium. And so once you introduce large pools, then those large pools have a very dominant role, and voting directly, you're throwing out your vote. There's no influence there at all.
Possibly, Kevin, I don't want to get too detailed on that though again, but
Yeah.
in the absence, all I will say before going to Sophie is in the absence of a control group, as Daniel was saying, there's practical concerns. And in the absence of control group, then the emphasis then becomes on this good documentation of what's happening as it's happening. And that comes back to say things like oversight. So keeping good track, and we can work with liaise with IOG on there, what's happening, and then, to see, is that having any unforeseen circumstances? Is it returning on intention? That kind of thing. And I think that's the best we can do given a pragmatic approach, perhaps. Sophie.
Yeah, I know. I understand as well that like doing such a split creates a huge overhead, and you kind of have to almost double whatever capacity you have now, and maybe even more, because well, then you have to also coordinate between the two. But to stay in the realm of the possible, and sort of moving away from this, but thinking in the same line. One thing I have been thinking about. And like anything we can achieve with alignment, is if we make a challenge that, let's say it's like a million, for example, and then it has like very specific rules. It's not for people to do like a proposal and a plan, but it's to start a treasury that is like a mini catalyst experiment, right? Run by whoever proposes it. But they all have to have exactly the same budget, right? They all need to have, you have to ask for 200,000, for example. So there's 5 of them within the million, and that makes them comparable experiments, right? And then they can do like a specific experiment with how they're going to do reputation, or how they're going to distribute those that treasury to the community. And then there should be some more rules, like it has to be open to anyone to participate or to put in a proposal or something like that. They have to have some rules for transparency, some initial founding rules of like how they're going to govern themselves and come up with new rules, some like a minimum viable catalyst,
Yeah,
or something like that. And
No,
then yeah, and then we can do the same thing in like community-led smaller versions, and then we can test there. Like, and I know it's not exactly the same, but
I hear you that it's certainly in the realms of possibility. Whether it's whether it's immediately practical or desirable in the short term is another question, because there's the question of what are the challenge team's strategic goals immediately, because if we already have things coming online, like early experiments, if you like, in governance, like the DREP, then something like that, even though it's interesting, could then just be, and again, the community adding another layer of complexity, which could be a distraction to, this could be overcomplicate things. That's all I'm saying. But and also another issue that comes to mind is the community mature enough to do that? And I don't mean to be derogatory here, but because that would also require a certain level of sophistication in terms of the design of, because essentially you're just proposing a mini Catalyst treasury, and that is, again, I hear what you're saying. It's very interesting, but it does require some sophistication, and it's another experiment that you're running within an existing experiment, you know. So, and that also raises questions of why are you doing that, you know, kind of thing.
Yeah, maybe it shouldn't be as like another catalyst, but there are treasuries popping up in the community, right?
Oh,
and so maybe they can be smaller scope in what they try to fund, but in the end it's about funding participation, right? And people that are building. So I think I do agree that like the community is also going to struggle with doing these things properly, but I would also say that it is already happening, but not in a structured way where we're all trying to fit, at least in some way, make it comparable, right? And if we would make it into a challenge where there are some guidelines and some similarities like the budget, then they would also be more comparable as experiments. So maybe more as a challenge to support those things like swarm treasury and things like that.
Absolutely.
Maybe more from that angle.
Absolutely. There's another thought I'd like to throw back at you, because I'd like to hear what you say, is there's also the argument that, and I'm thinking back to Kiayias' paper here in terms of sustainable development and sustainable participation. If you do that, you're still internal to Catalyst. So you're still, that challenge still has to be renewed, okay? So where's the sustainability? You're still dependent upon the container that you're in. So is a more strategic path to sustainable development and sustainable participation for a community. Let's say we did this with Swarm or something. So we say, okay, we want to transform into to meet that those blockchain properties of sustainable development and sustainable participation. It's not going to happen in the challenge setting in Catalyst, because that's not sustainability, because you have to renew the challenge. You know, so is a more sustainable option something like delegation, stake pools, or some tokenomic solution?
Yeah, no, that's a very valid point. It's not a long term. It could only work as sort of like a Kickstarter, and then it needs to become somehow also create like some funds coming in, and that's definitely not easy. So yeah, that is a good point.
I like the way you describe it as a Kickstarter, though, because that, you know, then maybe that's what it should be or could be. You know, but I would be concerned with creating a trap for yourself immediately, if you like. You know, but so choosing the wrong option when you have other options on the table, like maybe a community network of staking pools or some kind of bonding curve tokenomics or something like that. But I think we're getting speculation. Jonathan, what do you think? You'll be sitting there. I'm waiting for an answer from you, Jonathan.
I don't have an answer, but you're triggering thought, certainly.
Yeah.
The idea of internal external tech catalyst is very interesting to me, and I do love the idea of like the Ryuki network of stake pools as a way to produce sustainable funding. But I also was just thinking then about, you know, the CF delegations at the moment are struggling in terms of internal capacity within CF. I understand, just in terms of the number of wallets that they can use to delegate to. They're keeping it low, and they're delegating 15 million or whatever it is, just because they don't have the manpower to manage, like IOG do, the number of wallets they're actually doing the delegation. I mean, it's a big task to organize millions of dollars of ADA into multiple wallets and doing all accounting and all that sort of stuff. Having people responsible for those spending keys and things like that. But if there was a funded, you know, maybe it's it's kind of internal to Catalyst again. You've got Catalyst voting on a delegation strategy for CF, for example, where Catalyst are driving the decision making, and actually the funding for the organization of delegating that fund is as an infrastructure cost that's just part of Catalyst itself. That seems like a way to produce a, you know, slightly detached from Catalyst way of creating sustainable revenue, but also contributed to, you know, the decision making by Catalyst.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. Would that be a proposal or a challenge? And so you would.
Well, it's kind of reliant on CF agreeing to.
Yeah. I mean, I've two aspects to that. I could imagine, for example, someone building a development application that would automate a lot of that delegation, for example, and then maybe provide a front end to that. So I imagine that's possible, you know. And then
Smart
there's
contracts.
Yeah, that kind of, and then there's the other side of it, which is like the governance aspect of it, where the community, and I know CF are interested in hearing from the community more on their delegation and also on maybe, you know, how they vote, maybe. So on challenges, I mean, and so that could be a proposal, couldn't it? That could be something funded by Catalyst, which is like a kind of community group where, you know, which liaises with CF, for example, on. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, certainly. And, you know, even if it's just to present an idea that CF could then, you know, make their own decisions on, it's something that's, you know, got strong backing from a community vote, and could relieve them of a lot of burden, and, you know, provide a team with a nicely funded project to build out some infrastructure like that, something that then any, you know, large treasury could use to manage their delegation strategy, whether that's IOG or Emergo or you know, Swarm eventually down the road or something like that. You know, it's become a community tool that's useful for more than just a single treasury. Yeah,
I mean, I'm not sure if anyone's looked at. I know there's issues in the stake pool community around sustainability, and you know, all the debates about single stake pool operators, multiple stake pool operators, and all that. But I'd be interested to see if someone's looked at that. I think someone was really early in on the call who was talking about using the Aggelos paper as and the different blockchain properties to get a kind of a model, a governance model for a stake pool, you know, basically. And I haven't really seen any research on that or any many papers on that, like how could you use delegations to stake pool to run governance, you know, to provide a sustainable, if you like, treasury for governance. I haven't come across. Have you, Kenrick?
Well, to me, the way to do that is just to change, you know, the settings in the Catalyst program itself as to what percentage of the program is for oversight of the program, you know, that and that's where, in fact, we haven't made a lot of progress on this, but one of the first things I put in the Circle board was the need for an operational budget. And, you know, that would have to be decided on by the community. But the idea would be that just as you kind of, if I understand right, it's about 20% of the transaction fees go into the Catalyst program, or some percentage, right? So now you have this Catalyst fund, but some portion of that, maybe it's 1%, maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 10%, I don't know. But some percentage of that needs to be an operational budget that is for the funding of the running of the program itself. And then the rest of it is to fund the actual initiatives in the proposals. But, you know, we are covering that expense right now through IOG. IOG is still the one that's running this program. and they're covering the expenses of the extraordinary work that Dan and Chris and everyone else on the IGOG team are doing to make it operational. So one of my requests to Harris was provide us some insight as to how much it's costing to run Catalyst, because the community is going to need to know that in order to set aside the right amount of that Catalyst treasury to actually have the right operational budget.
I mean, I suppose I hear you, and that is an ongoing concern with well, it's a sustainability concern, isn't it, with the community in terms of how do we sustain things that have emerged in like administration of Capital Circle and other stuff coming down the line on that as well. But I suppose what I was thinking more in relation to what Jonathan was saying, and what is, and it may even be a solution to the problem of single state pool operators versus multiple state pool operators. And it maybe this would require some intervention, is what if the state pool model was a governance model? Okay, became more of a governance model. So it becomes like like the product on the shelf example we gave before between Polkadot and Cardano. Okay, well, if you went along to the shelf and you said this state pool is this governance model, okay, and it's sustainable because it's doing X, Y, Z, okay, and I can choose that.
I don't like that as far as the Catalyst program itself. Like that's, I think anyone can take that initiative and, you know, set up a pool and describe it for serving certain purposes. But, you know, the writing of proposals by the administrative and circle members, the setting up of a pool, those are all good initiatives for the short term. But to me, they're not long-term solutions to having an appropriate operational budget to run the program.
I don't know, I'm just thinking of the counter argument. You could turn that around and say, well, the SPO solution is more sustainable because if you're avoiding that institutional layer, you know, because an operational budget is an institutional layer, because it does raise new questions, doesn't it, Kenrick, in terms of who decides where that money goes. I know there's Capitalist Circle and things like that, but it's still a layer of bureaucracy, isn't it? It's an institution, essentially. So yeah, there is that criticism.
Well, this is another, like the word institution is a little bit loaded in the sense that
sure.
We're kind of saying that we are going to do things different and better than the current institutions. But the reality is, if you're successful, you're going to become an institution, whether you like it or not. You know, because success is a much bigger enterprise, and with success becomes the challenges of running bureaucracies, running institutions.
Is that a trap, though, Kenrick? Because
I think it's, well,
go on.
I'm sorry.
No, go on.
Well, it is and it isn't, in the sense that what really matters is the quality of the way I would put it is the quality of the institutions you design. So for instance, even if you look at the Cardano Foundation and the IOG, right, these are both large institutions now. You know, they're both large companies. They're both making impacts on the world. And if it continues to grow, you know, the Cardano treasury is going to outscale both of them, you know, in terms of what the impact is going to be.
Yeah, but that's a commercial,
or really well-designed organizations. And so that's why I say the word institution is loaded in the sense that it's pejorative.
Yeah, exactly. I suppose I'm thinking of the rationale of IOG itself, which might say that's a commercial failure. The objective of IOG is to decentralize itself, and that will be a commercial success. You know, because if it moved to, I mean, I know this is very long term, we're talking about 5-10 years and things like the DCF and Johnny Nigel and all that sort of stuff. If that was achieved, that would be a commercial breakthrough, because one, it would have to be resilient, but you would have a decentralized distributed corporate, or it wouldn't be corporate anymore, actually, would it? It wouldn't be a centralized corporate entity for a start. And that's essentially, from what I get from IOG and Cardano, that's where they want to go. You know, and whether we can get there or not, then that's not and the measure of success there is not that it becomes an institution. The measure of success is that it does not become an institution.
Okay.
Do you see my point? I mean, but I'm not sure.
I don't think that way, but I hear you what you're saying, but that's not the way I think about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. That is interesting.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah.
So
We'd like to hear from anyone else who hasn't spoken yet. Sorry.
I hope somebody decides that you need sleep, and then I can close call because I don't want to miss anything.
Yeah, should we close the set so I end the recording? And so we thank you everyone for contributing to this fascinating conversation.
yeah, you all are so engaging. I decided to skip the meeting. I was supposed to go to it.
Yeah. The slides and everything and the comments I'll upload to the Ekphrasis Gitbook, and the recording upload to QADAO and to Swarm YouTube channel. So again, thank you everyone. And I'll